From as far back as I can remember, I always felt like I didn't quite fit in. Growing up in a small town on the outskirts of Ohio, my world seemed limited, and my future was more of a fog than a clear path. My folks did the best they could. Dad worked long days in construction, and Mom kept everything running smoothly at home. I wasn't exactly the star of the family, just a regular kid blending in, both in school and in life. College didn't change much for me either. I went to a nearby community college and lived at home to save on rent. My grades were mediocre at best, and I spent more time working odd jobs than I did studying, whether flipping burgers or helping my dad at construction sites. By the time I finally graduated with a degree in business, I had this naive belief that opportunities would just start falling into my lap. I couldn't have been more wrong. Big-name companies weren't interested in someone like me. I didn't come from a prestigious school, and my average grades didn't turn any heads. Eventually, I landed a job at a small property management company, far from the high-powered corporate roles I'd imagined. My position was mundane, nothing flashy. But, ironically, this was where I stumbled onto something I never saw coming, a real passion for real estate. The owner of the firm, Mr. Granger, noticed I was taking an interest, and before long, he became a mentor to me, teaching me everything he knew. What started out as just a job became the beginning of a new career, one I hadn't anticipated at all. But now, I was ready to turn the page and start fresh. I parked my old SUV in the long-term lot at a major airport, guessing it would be at least a couple of weeks before anyone noticed it had overstayed. Carrying only a small suitcase and my briefcase, I walked toward the Delta terminal. The briefcase wasn't just for show. It held everything I needed for my new life. A handful of IDs, a few thousand in cash, and all my travel documents. To anyone watching, I probably looked like just another businessman rushing to catch a flight. But someone who really knew me would have sensed that something was off. The name on the ID was different, though the face on it was unmistakably mine. Today marked the first step into a completely new life, with a new identity. As I made my way through security, the TSA didn't bat an eye. They scanned my bag, wallet, and keys. No dangerous items, no water bottles. Satisfied, they let me pass without a second glance. My next stop was the restroom, where I quickly slipped into one of the stalls. Underneath my business attire, I had a different outfit, a brightly colored shirt, shorts, and some casual shoes. When I emerged, I no longer looked like a corporate drone. Instead, I blended in with the tourists returning from sunny vacations, just another guy back from a weekend getaway. I wandered over to the baggage claim and spotted a small, unmarked suitcase that no one seemed to notice. I grabbed it casually and headed toward the exit, merging with the sea of passengers. 10 minutes later, I hopped onto the terminal tram and got off at another terminal. In another restroom, I shed more layers, stashing my previous outfit in the stolen suitcase. After heading to the ticket counter, I used one of my fresh IDs to check the bag and collect my boarding pass. This time, I wouldn't need to pass through security again. I wandered around the shops for a while, blending into the crowd, before finally making my way to the exit. Soon, I was on the tram again, heading toward another terminal, this time to board an international flight. I had officially transformed into someone else. As I settled into my seat on the plane, I thought about what had led me to this moment, this drastic decision to vanish and start over. My wife, the unfaithful traitor, would never find me or the money I'd taken with me. I suppose I should go back and explain what really pushed me here. I was born in a small town in Ohio, back in 1960. I was an average student, graduating high school somewhere in the middle of the pack. I wasn't great at sports or academics, just your everyday kid with nothing special going for him. My parents weren't wealthy, either. Mom stayed home, and Dad worked construction. I stayed local for college, too, attending a small school and living at home to save cash. During the school year, I worked at a fast food joint, and in the summers, I labored with my dad on various job sites. My grades? Not great. A 2.6 GPA over 4 years. I barely put in the effort, just enough to scrape by. After getting my business degree, I was eager to jump into the workforce, ready to carve out a space for myself. But it didn't take long for reality to sink in. No big companies wanted me. I didn't have the pedigree or the impressive resume to stand out from the top-tier graduates. So, instead of landing a cushy corporate gig, I found myself at a small, low-paying property management firm. There were no fancy offices, no assistants, just me, a desk, and a phone, with more work than I could handle for barely any money. I quickly learned that in small businesses, you do a little bit of everything. I was chasing tenants for overdue rent, handling evictions, interviewing prospects, and even helping the maintenance guys clean up and paint between tenants. It wasn't glamorous, but I got hands-on experience in every aspect of the real estate business. And slowly, I realized I was starting to love it. My boss, Mr. Granger, saw that spark in me and decided to take me under his wing. He had kids of his own, but none of them were interested in the business, so I guess I became the protege he always wanted. One day, he called me into his office. "Sam, take a look at these foreclosures the bank sent over. Let me know which ones you think would be good investments," he said. "I've never done this before," I replied. "No worries. I'll go over your choices before we commit. But I'll need your suggestions after lunch," he added. It was already 10 a.m., and lunch at his company was promptly at 12. I barely had 2 hours. Skipping lunch, I pored over the listings, trying to make sense of it all. By 1 p.m., I presented my picks, only for him to tear them apart. "You've got a lot to learn, Sam," he said. "Let me show you how it's done." That week, we went through every option together, and by the end, we found a few gems. He put in bids on 4 properties and won just one, a 4-unit apartment building from the 1910s. It was in a neighborhood that was up and coming, perfect for young couples and students. The building needed work, but we got it for a steal, with construction loans covering the renovations. That was the start of something big. We purchased that old building with barely any money down, and the renovation funds were fully secured at closing. After we wrapped up the paperwork, Mr. Granger handed me the keys and said, "This one's yours now. You're in charge. Start tomorrow." The next 6 months were a roller coaster of emotions, highs and lows I hadn't expected, but I gained more experience than I ever thought possible. By the time the first mortgage payment rolled around, every apartment in the building was filled, and things were running like a well-oiled machine. Just when I thought I had found my rhythm, Mr. Granger hit me with another surprise. "Sam, sign these papers for that 4-unit building we bought." "Sure, but what's this for?" I asked, curious. "I'm transferring it to you," he replied, with a calm smile. "It's your building now." I was floored. "You can't be serious," I exclaimed. "Sam, I'm not getting any younger," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I want to pass along what I know to someone who can actually use it. My kids? They'll sell off all my properties the second I'm gone, and that's their right. But I'd rather you start your own real estate business with this gift." That's how my journey in real estate truly began. Eventually, I established my own company, Sampson Properties, LLC. Mr. Granger passed away about 5 years later, and just as he'd predicted, his children sold off his entire portfolio. They were after top dollar and quickly found a buyer who was willing to pay. By that time, I had built up my own collection of 15 properties, all in great neighborhoods and fully rented out. My financial model was simple. If only half of any building was occupied, it would cover the costs. Luckily, most of my properties operated at full capacity, so while I wasn't filthy rich, I was doing quite well for myself. When the guy who bought Granger's business went bankrupt trying to live the high life, I acquired a few more commercial properties from him. He thought he could hire a bunch of staff and spend his days on the golf course. He couldn't have been more wrong. I was about 30 when I met the woman who would become my wife. I had just purchased a commercial space in a decent part of town, and she and a friend leased one of the office suites for their new interior decorating business. When we first met, I was dressed the same as I always was, just another guy working on the building. But Wendy, along with her business partner, looked like they'd just stepped out of a high-end fashion magazine. As decorators, I guess it was their job to make an impression, and boy, did they make one on me. Wendy was the more outgoing of the two, and she quickly won me over. I couldn't help but imagine her standing in front of a cozy house with 2 kids, waiting for me to come home from work. I saw myself as the dad in that picture. When it came time to talk rent, I could tell they couldn't afford the price I initially quoted. "The building's fairly empty right now," I fibbed. There was only one other vacancy. "So, I can offer you a discounted rate for the first year." "How much of a discount?" they asked in unison. About half, I replied, keeping my voice steady. I have some flexibility with new tenants. They jumped at the offer and signed a 1-year lease with an option to renew. Wendy then asked, "Can we get the owner's name and address to send a thank you note?" I gave them my mother's maiden name and the company's P.O. box, explaining that the owner preferred to stay out of the limelight. "Just a short note will do," I added. For the next year, I helped them with anything they needed, blending in as just another worker. I watched as their small business steadily grew. By the time the second year rolled around, they renewed their lease at a higher rate, though still 25% below market. Wendy, the one I had fallen for, pulled me aside one day to tell me that her business partner was getting married and moving to the West Coast. "Can I get out of the lease early?" she asked, clearly worried. "I don't think I can afford it on my own." I didn't want her to go, and the thought of losing her made my heart race. "I'm not sure about breaking the lease," I began, "but I can lower the rent back to its original level. The boss hates empty office spaces." The truth was, I didn't want her leaving. Her face lit up, and she kissed me on the cheek, sealing the deal. I was completely smitten. After we parted ways, she flashed me a look and a smile I hadn't seen before. That was the start of something real between us. A year later, we were standing at the altar, saying our vows. Within another year, our daughter was born. Wendy had a rough pregnancy, and after the birth, the doctor advised against having more children. She had her tubes tied, and our family life seemed settled. But something changed in her. While I was still deeply in love, Wendy's passion for family life began to fade. She shifted all her focus to her growing business, and soon, she no longer saw me as anything more than a guy who fixed things around the house. She never knew that I actually owned several properties. Whenever I tried to tell her, she brushed me off. "I don't want to hear about your work, Sam. It's boring," she'd say. To keep our family together, I swallowed my pride and accepted her low opinion of me. Wendy was still gorgeous, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Despite her dismissive attitude, I endured it all. Our daughter became the center of my world. Every free moment I had, I spent with her. Watching her grow was the only thing that kept me going. As the years passed, Wendy and I drifted further apart. She gravitated toward her wealthy clients, while I quietly kept buying properties, slowly building my empire in the background. I held on to some properties long-term while selling others for quick profits, gradually building a hidden fortune. Wendy had no idea how much I had quietly amassed over the years. As time passed, she grew more distant, treating me with increasing disdain. Eventually, I found myself banished to the guest bedroom. The reasons? She claimed it was my snoring, my restless tossing and turning, and of course, the fact that I always smelled like a construction worker. In the beginning, I was allowed in her bed once a week, but over time, even that faded to once a month, if I was lucky. The only reason I put up with it at all was my daughter. I knew that if I confronted Wendy and we ended up divorcing, she would get custody, and I couldn't bear the thought of being cut out of Amy's life. I loved my daughter too much to let that happen. So, I poured all my frustration into my real estate empire, running it like a covert operation. I set up multiple shell corporations, used different P.O. boxes, had various office fronts, and hired employees that worked out of separate buildings. At my main office, it was just me and my loyal bookkeeper, and everyone else saw me as just another worker. I never bothered to correct their assumptions. By the time Amy turned 15, I had accumulated over $25 million in mortgage-free properties and another $50 million tied up in properties with small mortgages. All these assets were scattered across different companies and locations, with rental income going to separate P.O. boxes. A significant portion of that money was discreetly funneled into offshore accounts to avoid extra taxes. My wealth was growing, and I owned almost 100 properties. These weren't just small apartment buildings anymore. There were shopping centers, office complexes, and even a mall. Amy and I had become incredibly close. I was the parent who was always there for her. Whether she had a basketball game or was homesick from school, I was the one by her side, cheering her on or holding her hand. We spent countless weekends together, shopping, going to the movies, or just hanging out. It was the kind of relationship most moms and daughters have, but it was me filling that role, not Wendy. By now, Wendy's business had taken off. She never noticed that I still lived modestly, never flaunted wealth, and didn't brag about what I was doing. Because of this, she continued to see herself as the breadwinner, looking down on me as if I were just some burden she had to carry. I let her think that way because, frankly, I didn't want her knowing the truth. The last thing I needed was for her to realize how much money I had stashed away, and then divorce me and take half of it. Wendy had a habit of making me feel like I was a second-class citizen in my own home. She'd mock my work, call me boring, and made it clear she thought she was the only one in the marriage pulling her weight. I tolerated her jabs and insults, all to keep my family intact. But I wasn't a fool. I was quietly moving more and more of my money into offshore accounts, preparing for the day when Wendy might decide to move on. Her interior design business meant she had to hire a lot of creative types. Most of them were young, trendy, and flamboyant. Wendy knew I was uncomfortable around some of them, and she took great pleasure in making sure I was paired with the ones who were the most forward with their attentions. These guys didn't always respect boundaries, and Wendy enjoyed every moment of it. It was just another way she could remind me how little she thought of me. I tolerated it all, though, just to stay close to Amy. I had become a coward in my own life. Wendy, on the other hand, saw things from a different perspective. In her eyes, Sam, the husband she now barely acknowledged, was a decent guy but lacked the ambition to match her own. While she chased success, I seemed content to hold her back. To Wendy, I was average in every way. An average husband, an average lover, and someone she'd outgrown long ago. The only thing I did well in her eyes was dote on Amy. Wendy couldn't figure out why she had ever married me. She saw me as a guy stuck in a dead-end job, nothing more than an errand boy for some wealthy, unseen real estate mogul. When Wendy started her decorating business with her friend Beth, she easily got me to cut their rent and throw in some extras. In her second year of business, Wendy and Beth realized they weren't a good match. Beth was the ethical one, whereas Wendy would do whatever it took to close a deal. If a client was male, Wendy would flirt and hint at possibilities, making them believe something more was on the table. If a female client seemed curious, Wendy would entertain their interest just to secure the contract. Beth, on the other hand, had standards. She couldn't handle Wendy's underhanded tactics, so she moved out west with her boyfriend, leaving the business to Wendy. Wendy didn't give her a penny in compensation, either. With Beth gone, Wendy worried about whether she could afford the rent on the fancy office suite alone. So, she turned her charms on me once again, and I caved. I lowered the rent for another year. Wendy gave me a half-teasing kiss as a thank you, but it was the first time in a long while that I'd felt any affection from her. After that kiss, something stirred in me. Maybe it was because I hadn't been with anyone else in a long time. Despite all my complaints about Wendy, she was still a good lover when she wanted to be. Unlike the other men in her life, I was always focused on her needs, making sure she was happy even when she clearly didn't return the favor. I rarely got involved with other women, and when I did, it was strictly for business reasons. But Wendy never appreciated that. Outside of the bedroom, I was just a boring, predictable man to her. Someone who wasn't interested in art, culture, or anything exciting. At social gatherings, Wendy would roll her eyes whenever I tried to make small talk because I only talked about real estate or bookkeeping. It was as though she had forgotten who I really was, or maybe she never knew in the first place. I tried everything to get Sam more involved in my world. I took him to operas, symphony concerts, and even plays, but he'd always start dozing off, and I'd spend half the time nudging him awake. Since my business was in interior design, I had to attend charity events to network and get my name out there. When I brought Sam along, though, it felt like I was dragging dead weight. He'd sit quietly at the table, barely engaging, and made no effort to fit in. He didn't even dress appropriately for the events. Instead of being an asset, he became a liability. Sure, I could have worked on improving his image, but I was far too focused on growing my business. One day, I received an invitation to another charity gala, and this time, I didn't even bother telling Sam until it was too late for him to make any changes to his plans. "Sam, I'm going to the event tonight, even if you're not able to come," I said. "It's crucial for my business, and you know I'm the one supporting our lifestyle. Won't it look bad if you go by yourself?" Sam asked. "I'll bring one of the decorators from the office," I replied. He'll be visible enough to avoid any confusion. Trust me, no one's going to mistake him for a romantic partner. That night, everything changed. I was standing by the bar, scanning the crowd for my date, who had probably disappeared with someone else at the party. That's when a strikingly handsome man approached me. "Excuse me," he said with a charming smile, "but it looks like your escort has left you on your own. I'm James Hawthorne, and I'd be honored to keep you company for the evening, if you'll let me." The first thing that crossed my mind was how gorgeous he was. James was polished, confident, and carried an air of wealth and sophistication. I accepted his offer, and we had an incredible time together. During the taxi ride home, I felt a rush of excitement, but it wasn't because of Sam. It was because of James. About a week later, James called me. "Hey, Wendy, how about joining me for lunch? I'm thinking of redecorating my office and would love your input," he said smoothly. That was how it all started. Within a month, we became lovers, sneaking away 2 or 3 afternoons a week to meet at different hotels. James wasn't exactly better than Sam in certain ways. Sam had always been considerate, putting my needs first, while James didn't care much for that. In fact, James treated me as though I were beneath him, while Sam had always treated me like a queen. But despite that, being with James was intoxicating. The thrill, the excitement, it was all-consuming. He made me do things I never imagined, things Sam wouldn't dream of. And sometimes, I left our meetings feeling sore from the intensity of it all. I craved James's control, his dominance. I was completely under his spell, and before long, he even started introducing other men into our encounters. I never thought I'd go that far, but with James, I couldn't refuse him anything. I wanted this secret life with him to continue, no matter what. But I needed more than just hotel rooms. I needed a space of my own where we could be together whenever we wanted. So, I devised a plan. "Sam, I started one evening. I'm going to rent an apartment in the city. The commute between the office and this farmhouse is draining me, almost an hour each way. I could be spending that time working, being productive. I know you love it out here, so you and Amy can stay on the farm. There's no need to disrupt your lives." "But Wendy," Sam began, clearly hurt by the idea. "I've made up my mind," I interrupted. "I've already narrowed it down to 2 choices, and I'll be moved in by the end of the month." I saw the sadness in his eyes, but I brushed it off. "Don't worry, honey. I'll still come home on weekends for you and Amy," I added, pretending everything would remain the same. James helped me pick out a high-end apartment just a few minutes away from my office. To make Sam feel involved, I brought him to see it and asked for his opinion, though I didn't wait for him to respond. "I knew you'd love it," I said. "It'll also serve as a great space to showcase my decorating skills." When we left, I noticed the building manager seemed to recognize Sam. I assumed they had crossed paths at some real estate event. Little did I know, Sam owned the building. The day Wendy moved into her new city apartment, supposedly to avoid the long commute, I knew our marriage was finished. I had long suspected she was seeing someone else, but this confirmed it. She had no idea that I owned the very building she had just rented her little escape in. The property manager, who was familiar with me, tried to speak with me when I came by, but I played it cool. I didn't want Wendy suspecting anything. Later, he gave me the full story. Wendy and her lover, James, had picked the apartment out together. They even filled out the lease forms as a couple, intending to use the place as their personal hideaway. That's when I decided I needed to take action. I loved Wendy despite everything, but this betrayal was too much to bear. I had to protect my daughter, Amy, and that meant gathering enough evidence to secure custody if things went south. The manager and I worked out a plan to wire the apartment for video and audio surveillance before Wendy moved in. The installation was disguised as part of a new security system upgrade for the entire building. I had more than enough resources to cover the cost, and Wendy would be none the wiser. Of course, this time, I made sure she paid the full rent. Actually, I even upped the price slightly. But since James was footing the bill, I didn't care. I also made sure the lease was in our name, not hers, to ensure that no lawyer could argue against the validity of the recordings I was about to gather. I continued gathering evidence for the inevitable divorce. With Wendy essentially moved out, my once-monthly visits to her bedroom stopped altogether. She had promised to come home on weekends, but that never happened. When Wendy did show up to visit Amy and me, Amy was thrilled to have her mom back in her life, even if it was just for short moments. At her age, she needed that connection, someone to talk to about things only a mother and daughter would understand. I thought it was just a phase, and I went along with it, but I had no idea how deep this would go. When Wendy did grace my bed on rare occasions, I found myself unable to perform. I couldn't get the images out of my mind. The thoughts of her with James, their intimate moments, and his constant belittling remarks about me. His words echoed in my head, and the worst part was hearing her agree with him, talking about how inadequate I was as a man and as a husband. "Sam, what's wrong with you?" she asked one night after yet another failed attempt. "We haven't had any kind of connection for months, and now you can't even get excited. If I didn't know better, I'd think you had someone else." "I'm sorry, Wendy," I muttered. "I've just got too much going on upstairs. I promise I'll do better next time." But there was no next time. James started sending the rent checks for Wendy's apartment directly to a rent collection P.O. box I had set up, which, of course, meant the payments ended up in my hands. I made copies of each check before depositing the originals into the bank. Some might wonder why I didn't seek immediate revenge. Don't worry, I had my ways. The manager at my bank was a close friend of mine, and he had connections at the bank James used. Just for fun, we decided to monitor his financial activity. We quickly discovered that James was living on a financial knife's edge, relying on the float time between his deposits and withdrawals to keep everything running smoothly. His accounts were often just a few steps away from overdraft. So, we began strategically timing the deposits of his rent checks. If we cashed them at certain points in the month, they would either bounce or cause his wife's checks to bounce. It didn't take long for the plan to work. James started getting hit with fees for return checks and late rent penalties from my company. Meanwhile, his wife was having her checks bounce at her favorite stores, leading to plenty of public embarrassment. Even her friends began requesting cash instead of splitting lunch bills with her. The chaos snowballed. James's credit rating took a hit from all the bounce checks and penalties. While his credit card companies didn't close his accounts, they lowered his credit limit to exactly what he owed, meaning he couldn't make any new charges. This also affected his wife, who shared the cards with him, and as you can imagine, she was furious. No woman likes having her credit card declined in public. I enjoyed every moment of their unraveling. Not only was James losing money to fees, but he also had to explain the whole financial mess to his wife without revealing that part of the problem was the apartment he was renting for my wife. I could only imagine how heated those conversations got. Then, as if fate had decided to lend me a hand, Wendy visited the doctor for what she called some female issues, and the news came back that she had ovarian cancer. She didn't even tell me. Our relationship had deteriorated to the point where she felt no need to share anything with me. It wasn't until Amy accidentally let it slip that I found out. "Dad, I'm going to stay with Mom while she goes through this," Amy told me one afternoon. "Why?" I asked, stunned. "Have I really been that bad of a father to you?" "No, Dad," she replied, her voice soft. "You've been great, but Mom needs me right now. Even though you don't love her anymore, I still do, and I want to be there for her." It hurt to hear that, but I understood. I missed Amy already, but I had to stay focused on my endgame. If she wanted to be with her mother during this ordeal, I couldn't stop her. I figured it might even work out in my favor. Perhaps by living with Wendy, Amy would see who her mother really was. That Sunday, for the first time in years, I went to church. Not to pray for Wendy's recovery, far from it. I went to thank God for sending this challenge into her life. As awful as it sounds, her cancer was the break I needed. Wendy was suffering, and it wasn't me who had to deal with it. James was now the one who had to clean up after her, watch her hair fall out, see her body weaken and waste away. I watched one of the tapes, and it showed how he treated her during her illness. He left her in misery until he felt like stepping in to help. Amy must have seen it too because she became her mother's primary caregiver. I made an appointment with my lawyer. "I want out of this marriage," I told him. "And I want out without losing any of my money, aside from your fees, of course." He gave me the standard rundown about no-fault divorces and how everything would likely be split 50-50, but I had other plans. I handed him all the video and audio recordings I'd collected, along with copies of the rent checks James had been sending for Wendy's apartment and the lease application they'd both signed. Prepare everything, but don't file anything until I give the signal, I instructed him. With that done, I started quietly selling off my properties. I had to be careful not to flood the market and drive prices down. Luckily, the real estate market was booming, and some of the new companies in the area were eager to expand. They got into bidding wars over my prime properties, often paying more than I had anticipated. I began quietly packing up personal items and removing them from the house, preparing for the sale. I had scheduled the closing date for the day after Wendy would be served with divorce papers. After 6 months of careful planning, I gave my lawyer the signal to send all the evidence to Wendy's lover's wife. Once she found out the truth, she kicked him out. He moved in with Wendy and Amy, and they tried to start a new life together. At least, that's what they thought. But things unraveled quickly. His wife had frozen his assets, and I had already emptied Wendy's accounts into my offshore holdings, leaving them with nothing. One day, Phil, the manager of Wendy's apartment building, left me an urgent message. "Check the video I'm sending today. Your daughter is in trouble." I hadn't reviewed the surveillance footage in months, trusting my lawyer's assurance that we had enough evidence for the divorce. But Phil's message caught my attention. Later that afternoon, I received the CD. What I saw on the footage shattered me. The video showed a gradual descent over the past few months. Wendy's lover had been mistreating Amy and pressuring her into things no father should ever have to witness. It was clear that Amy had become emotionally and mentally trapped, asking her mother, "Why did you let this happen?" Wendy knew, but she did nothing to intervene. As the footage continued, it was clear Amy had become dependent on the situation, clinging to the toxic relationship in exchange for security and manipulation. By the end of the footage, I knew it was too late to undo the damage that had already been done. At 4 a.m., after hours of processing the shock, I called my lawyer. "We have to do something for Amy. Get her out of that situation before it gets worse," I said, trying to stay composed. The next morning, Alan, my lawyer, called me back. He explained that although Amy was legally an adult, we could still try to intervene. I didn't care about the legal limits. I wanted to help my daughter. Later that day, Alan called with more unsettling news. Amy was pregnant, and Wendy's lover was most likely the father. To make matters worse, he had been exploiting her, taking advantage of her vulnerability. Alan informed me that one night, while they were meeting someone at a hotel, the client turned out to be an undercover police officer. Wendy's lover was arrested on multiple charges, including contributing to her downfall. I wasn't sure how strong the case against him would be, but to strengthen it, I decided to send the surveillance footage to both the police and the media. The public exposure ensured that Wendy's lover wouldn't be able to rebuild his life, and it gave his wife leverage in their divorce. In the meantime, he remained in jail, unable to make bail, and Amy was also taken into custody. Alan advised me to let Amy stay in jail, where she could be enrolled in a treatment program. If I bailed her out too early, he warned, she might fall right back into old habits. As much as it hurt, I agreed. Keeping her in a secure environment would give her the best chance at recovery. Later that day, I worked on the footage to ensure the right individuals were held accountable. A few weeks later, justice found them, but Wendy's lover, still behind bars, was untouched by these events. Meanwhile, Wendy's health had continued to decline. Her business collapsed while she underwent treatment, and a few of her former employees, with my discreet support, started their own firm and took most of her clients. Wendy's company dissolved, and as her landlord, I had no choice but to evict her from the office space. With no income and no health insurance, Wendy called me, pleading to be added to my health plan. I agreed, but I had planned for this. My insurance didn't cover pre-existing conditions, so it wouldn't do her much good. Which brings me to where I am now, on a plane headed for South America. Once I arrive, I'll disappear completely, using new identities to move through Europe before settling somewhere warm, far away from everything I've left behind. Wendy, the authorities, no one would be able to find me. Before leaving, I made a final call to Alan. "Amy's been trying to get in touch with you," he said. "She's looking to reconcile, and she's learned about your financial success." I told Alan to handle it. I wasn't going to be reachable, at least not unless I decided to be. I instructed him to continue using my resources to prepare a defense for Amy, but to let her stay in the program for now. She was making progress in overcoming her addiction, and I didn't want to risk her relapsing by releasing her too soon. 6 months later, I followed up with Alan about the divorce proceedings. He informed me there was no need. Wendy had lost her battle with cancer before the paperwork could be finalized. Since we were still legally married, and she had no remaining assets, I was free to move forward without the complications of a divorce. I found myself responsible for Wendy's medical bills when she passed away. She died alone, in a charity ward, with no visitors and in pain. Despite everything, I felt a small pang of guilt as I paid her bills. Wendy had once been the love of my life, even though her choices and selfishness had destroyed our marriage. A part of me still cared for her, even though I could never forgive her for what she had done. I was overseas when Wendy passed, and Amy was still in jail. There was no funeral, no service. Alan informed me that her ashes were at the county coroner's office, waiting for someone to claim them. If no one did, she would be buried in an unmarked grave with others. Alan paused, clearly expecting me to step in and handle Wendy's remains, but I had no intention of doing so. She had caused too much heartache for me to feel any obligation now. "Tell me about Amy," I asked, changing the subject. "She lost the baby about 4 months into the pregnancy due to complications," Alan explained. "She's currently serving a 12-month sentence for possession, but she's in a good rehabilitation program and seems to be making some progress." "And Wendy's lover?" I asked, though I already knew what had happened. "He died in prison during a fight," Alan said. "It seems his kind don't fare well with the other inmates." "Well, if Amy asks for help with her mother's arrangements, give her the funds to take care of it. If she's clean and committed to staying that way, support her until she can stand on her own. But if she's not clean—" I hesitated, the words bitter in my mouth. "Just give her enough to get by. I don't want her falling back into a dangerous life. If she can't overcome her struggles, I'd rather she doesn't suffer. But if she manages to beat the odds and stay clean, she'll have my full support." I knew it sounded harsh, but the thought of Amy living a life of addiction terrified me. I couldn't bear to see her trapped in that cycle. But if she somehow overcame it, I was more than willing to give her the resources she needed to rebuild her life. After all, I had more than enough money. Maybe, just maybe, she'd prove everyone wrong. For years later, I found myself driving through town to visit Alan, my old attorney. He was retiring and closing down his practice, and I wanted to wish him well in his new chapter. Alan had been more than just my lawyer. He'd been my only real friend. I was just an old man now, and he was the only person who seemed to care whether I lived or died. As I drove my new Bentley through the familiar streets, memories flooded back, some good, some not so much. I took the time to drive by some of the properties I had once owned. Many of the apartment complexes I had sold were still in great shape, and the commercial spaces had only grown in value. It was a shame that divorcing Wendy had forced me to hide my assets. I sometimes wondered if things would have been different if she had known the full extent of what I owned. But those questions didn't matter anymore. I pulled up to Alan's office, one of the few buildings I still owned. I had kept it primarily because it housed his practice, and I wanted him to feel secure. Now that he was retiring, I planned to give him the building as a gift, something for his old age. "Ah, you old rascal," Alan greeted me as I walked in. "Takes one to know one," I replied with a grin. We shook hands and embraced, slipping easily into old jokes and conversation. It was as if no time had passed. After catching up, Alan paused. "Aren't you going to ask about Amy?" "Not really," I said, though I knew he was about to tell me anyway. "You'd be proud of her, Sam," Alan continued. "After she got out of jail, she enrolled in another rehab program and completed it. She stayed on as a counselor and has been doing really well." I tried to sound indifferent. "Whoopee," I said sarcastically, but deep down, I felt a flicker of pride. "She didn't stop there," Alan continued, unfazed. "Amy enrolled in a social work program at the local college, finished it in 3 years, and is about to graduate. She's worked hard, Sam. And I'm guessing I paid for it all," I muttered. "Well, I took a few liberties with your instructions," Alan admitted. "You might also want to meet your son-in-law, Frank Murphy, and your granddaughter, Vivian. She's almost 7 months old now and already has quite the personality. She's going to be a beauty, just like her grandmother." I felt a wave of emotions I hadn't expected. Alan went on, "You've also been covering their living expenses, beyond what Frank's modest income can handle. They even have a nanny, Chloe, who lives in the apartment across the hall and helps out. She's giving Amy time to finish her studies and helping Frank build his career." I was taken aback, but managed to nod. "I suppose I should stay for the graduation," I said, almost reluctantly. Alan smiled. "I've already arranged for us to attend the ceremony and some of the surrounding events." At one of the pre-graduation events, I finally spotted Amy and her husband. I hadn't seen her in years, and the resemblance to her mother was startling. She had inherited Wendy's beauty, and seeing her like that hit me harder than I expected. It was as though I was staring at the woman I had once loved, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. I pulled Alan aside. "I don't want to get involved in her life again," I said quietly. "It's just too much." "I understand," Alan replied. "I'll make sure to keep things low-key." The next day, we sat in the stands during the graduation ceremony. As each graduate crossed the stage, their families and friends cheered and applauded. When Amy's name was called, I watched as Frank stood proudly with their baby in his arms. Even from a distance, I could see the tears in his eyes. The applause for Amy seemed to echo louder than anyone else's, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel a sense of hope. A wave of pride surged through me as Amy reached the center of the stage. The dean stopped her and announced, "It is with great pleasure that I present this special award to Amy Murphy. You've been selected by both your classmates and the faculty for this honor. Mrs. Murphy, you're being recognized for your selfless support and dedication to others. Thanks to you, more students are graduating today than ever before. The dropout rate since you started here has been nearly zero. Along with your diploma, you'll also receive a certificate of appreciation signed by all your classmates and the faculty. Amy, we all love you, and we'll miss you dearly." As Amy crossed the stage, the entire audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. In that moment, I felt a pride unlike anything I had ever experienced. My little girl had grown into an incredible woman, and I couldn't have been happier for her. Once the ceremony ended, I started making my way back to the car. The aisles were crowded with people, and I kept my head down, hoping to slip away unnoticed. As I moved through the crowd, I suddenly saw Amy, her husband, and my granddaughter walking nearby. Great, I thought, no way to escape this now. Amy and her husband didn't notice me, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw my granddaughter watching me intently. She clung to her father's neck, her eyes never leaving me. At nearly 9 months old, she seemed to have a strong sense of who I was. In her little voice, she started chanting, "Bopa," a word many kids use for their grandfathers. She waved her arms and kicked her legs, eager to get out of her father's grip. Amy reached over to take the baby from her husband, and when she looked in the direction the baby was pointing, her eyes landed on me. Unknown to me, their nanny, Chloe, had been showing my granddaughter pictures of me and explaining who I was. The little one had clearly learned well. To her credit, Amy didn't overreact. She simply smiled and said, "Hi, Dad. Thanks for coming and supporting us all these years." Alan told us about everything. I later found out that Alan had been keeping an eye on Amy's family all along. He had quietly informed Amy that it was my financial support that had covered her education and living expenses. He'd been playing the role of protector, making sure Amy knew it was me behind the scenes, even when I couldn't be there myself. I smiled at her, feeling the weight of years lift from my chest. "I wouldn't have missed your graduation for anything. As for paying your way, it was the least I could do. After leaving you to fend for yourself." Amy's husband, Frank, looked a bit flustered and stumbled over his words. It was clear he didn't know how to handle the situation. I steadied him by catching his arm, and at that moment, my granddaughter reached for my shirt, still calling out, "Bopa." Amy smiled warmly and said, "Vivian wants you to hold her, Dad. Would you like to carry your granddaughter?" Before I could respond, I found myself holding her. She wrapped her tiny arms around my neck and proudly announced to everyone nearby, "Bopa." I was hooked instantly. This little girl had completely stolen my heart. Suddenly, I was no longer just a lonely man. I was a grandfather, a father, and a father-in-law all at once, and it filled me with joy. The years of isolation began to fade, and for the first time in a long time, my heart felt lighter. Soon, we were standing in one of the large parking lots with Alan, my lawyer. "Sam," Alan said, "let's hop in your car and head to a restaurant. You've got some catching up to do with your family." As we approached my Bentley, Frank stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the car in disbelief. "Is this yours?" he asked, astonished. I smiled and tossed him the keys. "Want to take it for a spin, son?" The grin on his face was brighter than any of the lights in the parking lot. He was eager, and I could tell he had never driven anything like this before. We walked over to his beat-up old Ford to grab the car seat and the essentials for traveling with a baby. As I looked at his car, I made a quick decision. Tomorrow, I'd give Frank his own set of keys to the Bentley. I'd buy myself a new one later. As we drove, I found myself sitting in the back next to my granddaughter, who chattered away nonstop, her small hand clutching my arm. Amy was on the other side of her, and it felt right, like a family again. "Dad, we need to talk," Amy said softly. "I owe you an apology. I was such a foolish, selfish kid back then. I never realized how much it hurt you when I left to live with Mom." "You don't need to apologize," I said, choking back my emotions. "I'm proud of the woman you've become, and I know you needed your mother during those years just as much as she needed you. I just wish both of you hadn't been taken advantage of by that man." "But, Dad," she began. I cut her off gently. "Amy, I'd love to be part of your new life, if you'll have me. I made a lot of mistakes in our relationship," I admitted, "and I want to make up for them." "We do have a lot to talk about," Amy replied, "and I never want to see James again. He ruined Mom with his lies and dragged me into that world of pills. If Frank hadn't found me, I'd still be in jail, or worse, dead from an overdose. It took 4 attempts to finally kick the habit, and Frank's love helped me over that last hurdle. Now, Vivian is my reason for staying clean. There's so much I want to share with her, as her mother." Amy cried through most of the car ride, but not out of sadness. It was from the overwhelming feeling of family, a sense of finally being complete. We spent the next few days talking, at their apartment, over dinner, and at my hotel. For the next month, we worked through years of pain and loneliness. In the end, we both came to agree that Wendy had been at the root of many of our problems. Wendy had been selfish, focused solely on her own desires. She was beautiful on the outside but hollow inside. Yet despite everything, I still missed her. No one would ever take her place in my heart. Amy finally began to understand that I wasn't the villain her mother had made me out to be, but rather a man who had loved deeply and had been hurt just as much. One evening, Amy looked at me and said, "You still love her, don't you, Dad?" I sighed and nodded. "It still hurts when I think about how much she resented me. But yes, a part of me still loves her. I wasn't weak. I loved her with all my heart. But a long time ago, she hurt me so deeply that I had to protect myself from being destroyed." About 2 months into our reconciliation, my attorney Alan dropped a surprise on us during dinner. "What do you want me to do with Wendy's ashes?" "They've been sitting on a shelf in my office for a while now," he asked casually. The table went silent, and then, out of nowhere, Vivian spoke up. "Want Nana?" Amy and I exchanged glances. "Dad," she said, "I thought I'd never get to say goodbye to her, being in jail when she died. But now that I've heard your side of the story, I have some things I need to say to Mom too, some of them not very nice." I hesitated, then replied, "Okay, I have things to say as well, but I'm not apologizing. After everything she did, she deserved the choices I made." "I'm not blaming you," Amy said softly. "I lived with her and the man who dragged me down. They deserved what happened. So did I. I was awful to you until I hit rock bottom and began turning my life around." Frank chimed in. "Sam, I met Amy at a halfway house where she was a counselor. I was there for drinking, and she helped me get sober. We've been together ever since." We all agreed that Vivian should have some connection to her grandmother, even if it was just a gravesite. It would also give Amy and me a place to confront our feelings, to express both our anger and our forgiveness. A few days later, we picked up the urn from Alan's office. I put it in the trunk of my Bentley, hoping that the ride would be as uncomfortable for her ashes as car rides used to be for Wendy, who always got carsick. In the end, We decided to move to Virginia, buying a small farm outside the city. Frank and I decided to raise horses and offer stabling services. It felt like the fresh start we all needed. Wendy's ashes were eventually buried in a family plot on the farm, next to old remains dating back to the 1800s. We cleaned up the area and added a white picket fence, leaving room for future graves. I had a simple headstone made for her that read, Wendy Adams, 1956 to 1995. Cancer survivor. She will be missed by those who loved her. We all forgive you. As the years passed, I noticed that Vivian often played near Wendy's grave. One day, I asked her why she spent so much time there. Grandma talks to me and helps me read, she said matter-of-factly. She told me she's sorry for hurting you, and she hopes you'll forgive her. She also asked if she can wait here until it's your turn, so you can walk into the light together. For a moment, I froze, hearing those words. And then, somewhere deep inside, I heard Wendy's familiar voice. Nice try, Sam, but I don't get carsick anymore. The flood of emotions overwhelmed me, and I dropped to my knees, pulling Vivian close. Papa, why are you crying? She asked, looking up at me with wide, innocent eyes.